Hello, today I'm going to show you how to paint a lovely stone arch. It's a lovely summer's day, so there's a slight mackerel sky. So what I've got is some cerulean blue and a size 5 brush. I've made the paint quite concentrated, and I'm just taking the brush for a walk across the page so that it gives a speckled sky. But I don't want it all the way down because I want the beach to have equal importance. So I'm just getting it less and less towards the left. Same strokes but weaker paint going round the rock. I'm using rag paper today. I'm now just going wet into wet, just blending it in gently. It's the only white on the picture and there's a little bit of water at the bottom, so I'll stop short. Because of the scale, it looks better without too much of a complicated sky inside, so I'm just getting the water and moving the paint across to the middle. So I'm just going to go to the corner of the page, then using a slightly bigger brush go across in lines, and there are seaweed and puddles and all sorts of other things. I will put a list of materials used in the description as well as hints and tips. And because it's glued down, I'm going to go right to the edge of the paper. I want you to look into the picture, so what I'm doing is not a straight line here but a curve. And a curve here. And then further out is slightly more orangey because it's catching the sun, but it's lighter. I'm starting with the Naples yellow, and it doesn't go far because there's a river running down on the beach. I'll go round the people and round the rocks. I'm just going to use some water and just lighten it off a little bit. Then there's some blue to go in when it's dry. My next stage is to put the far cliffs in because I want the rocks in the middle that are catching the sun to really shine out. So I need to do these slightly hidden cliffs here, very pale. So I'm just going to use some yellow ochre and just make a line across. And then I'm going to go in with a little bit of Payne's grey mixed with blue, or you could use homemade grey, taking the sky colour just to give some harmony. And I'm going to do up and down strokes. And it is all cliffs showing, it's hardly any top. So just put some marks in. And then go in with some green on the top. And it's a long way away and it's a hazy day. So I'm just mixing it with a little bit of French ultramarine and Naples yellow, and again sideways strokes just to show the undulating top of the cliffs. And there's some grass coming a little bit down to the edge, so I'm just going to use yellow ochre and pull the green down a little bit. Mix a little bit of green in with it when it's wet. Do the two colours alternately. A little bit more yellow ochre, pushing the strokes up this time, and the yellow will send the green back. Now the rocks in the middle, use a bigger brush, are catching the sun on one side but not on the other. So I'm going to use some quite strong yellow ochre. Just go in with the shape of the rock. So using a clean brush now to move the paint that I've put down. And it's got lots of steps in it where it's been eroded. So I'm putting in the area that's catching the sun first. And then I can add some darks. There's also some things on top. I don't know whether they're old winches or what they are, but they're catching the sun as well. And the rest of it is grey, so I'm going to use a homemade grey and just drop that in very gently. And because it's got colours in that I've already got in the picture, I can tint it if I want to make it lighter or darker and it still harmonise. So I'm just going in roughly, claim space, and again with an area down here. And this one is much darker. So I'll put in the first layer and then go over it with some Payne's grey. Give the shape of the rock first. What I can also do to help give the shape of the rock is just add some very weak Naples yellow to highlight places, and that will send the grey back again. The homemade grey and the Payne's grey work well together, but I always add a little bit of blue to the Payne's grey just to neutralise it a little bit. And I'm going to do some of the dark areas just using the point of the brush. That's where there's shadows. There's a big shadow here. Doesn't matter if it bleeds a little bit, if it's still wet. And then on the corner here it's very dark. Just put some very dark in. I'm going to let that dry before I do any more, and so that I don't get too much of a harsh line, I'm just going to use a damp brush with no colour on it at all and just pull the lines out. Now coming to the rock with the hole in the middle, it's more grey because it's not catching the sun so much. I think this one would be more grey if it was in better light. So I'm going to use the homemade grey with a little bit more French ultramarine added. I'm just changing it because it's a different rock. And I'm going to follow the shape of it round. Doesn't matter if the brush skips a little. And there's a big wedge here, so I've got to make that a different colour by adding shadow. And then in the middle here where it meets the other rock, it's quite dark. So I'm just going to put a bit of shadow in, and I'm going to use water, and I'm going to take that out so that it's not dominant, all of it. Just go around with a wet brush, lots of water, just pull it back to the middle. Now I'm starting from the middle and working out, and that way I can get it looking round and not flat. And it's quite dark when it goes down to the bottom. It's shady and probably got growth on it from being covered in water. So again, cleaning the brush and taking the paint up from the bottom and then out from the line I made towards the rock. A little bit more paint just to give the roundness of it, and again taking the paint back to the middle. Now I need to concentrate on the area here that's much lighter again, so this time it's the homemade grey. I'm bringing it down as I go. It is darker where it meets the sky, and it's got quite a crisscross pattern of erosion. So I'm now going to put in some homemade grey and the Payne's grey together, because it's gone round the corner where it's light and then it's a little bit darker. So I'm mixing up some more homemade grey. The joy of mixing it up as you go is every batch is a different colour, which is good for rock. You don't want it all to be the same. Mostly water, just taking the brush for a walk up and down because it's a tall rock. Then I'll put the cross hatching in for the erosion next time in a different colour, going a different direction. And then down at the bottom it's really dark, so I'll just put the paint in a bit thicker, and there's lots of surface rocks. So I'm going with the shape and form of it by taking the brush up again in a curved motion. And then at the skyline it was quite dark, so going back in with the thicker version of the stronger version of the homemade grey, just dropping it in and then just pulling it back a little bit because there's a gully there, drying the brush off and then just moving it slightly so you can see that the rock's lipping down to the foreshore. And the next thing is there's a quite dark brown reflection, so I'm just going to add some indigo to burnt sienna and just gently put the reflection in before I lose it. I can make it darker later, but I just want to claim the space in the puddle here. And then there's a gap of sand and there's a little bit more of a reflection. And I'm going to drop a little bit of more indigo just into the wet paint now. Just drop it in. It looks more natural that way. Now the next stage, it says lots and lots of seaweed and water. So I'm going to start with the water because the other colours can go on top easily. So I'm changing to a bigger brush and changing to a mixture of French ultramarine and cerulean, and then just adding a little bit of turquoise because it's the colour's affected by the wet sand. And from left to right, right to left, just doing strokes to show that it's a little bit of wet sand there, and the water is just standing on it where it's a lower area. And then there's a little bit here as well, not too much, and it's quite solid as it meets the rock. So I'm just going with the tip of the brush and taking it out, and then further back it's a little bit more solid again, but not all over. And I'll take it back to the edge of the paper. So I've got to put seaweed in now. Just keep working on the tints till I think it'll show against other things. Seems to come from about here. I'm adding some chrome yellow straight on top of it. And it comes all the way to about here. And a little bit more chrome yellow just dropped in, just to lift it a little. Now while that's drying, I can return to the far beach, which has got some water showing behind the waves. And it's quite bright, so I'm going to use a little bit more French ultramarine. It's a long way off, but it's quite vivid. And then come forward to the sand, which, to make a change, I'm using Naples yellow. And that's brought that forward nicely. And there's a little bit of sea showing through the arch. I want to try and give a suggestion of a wave in there, so I'm going to make one layer first and then put a dark line on it in a little while. So I think dark line, I'll just use French ultramarine straight from the pan, a bit stronger on the brush, and just pop it in the middle. My next step is to define the rocks a little bit more. There's some areas that are quite light and others that are quite dark, so I'm using a combination of warm and cool. So I've got a little bit of Naples yellow on the side of the homemade grey, and I'm just going to show where there's a change in areas where there's some steps or a gully that go between the rocks. And again, on the top of the next rock, there's some very light areas. So a mixture of yellow ochre and Naples yellow, just to show the difference in the stone and the weathering. And there's some dark gullies that are around, but I want to just do the warm things first. There's sharp divides where the rock's just been eroded. So with a size 1 or 2 brush, just putting a few little marks on there, just so it doesn't look a solid surface. Then I'll go back with the homemade grey, tinted with a little bit of extra French ultramarine to make it a bit cooler. There's also a lot of seaweed there, which I'll put in a minute, but I just want to do the dark areas first. And there's almost like fingers coming out into the sand. So I'll put those dark areas in. Makes it more interesting to look at. Just feathering off this little line here. And I haven't got too much of a dark line where the next lot of rock goes, but a darker brown one. So I'm mixing some French ultramarine and burnt sienna together, and burnt umber, just to make a slightly darker colour. I'm just going to put that round the edge of the rock where one area's catching more sunshine than another, and just bring it across here. Rather than make it grey, I'll make it brown. I don't always want things to look sombre, it just needs to be dark, but it can be a warm dark. And on top, where it's going against the bright sky, sort of got semi-silhouette. So I'll put that in with the brown, and I'm going to pull the paint back just with a clean brush. And then I've got yellow on top where it's catching the sunshine, so I'm going to use yellow ochre and then go back in with a brown, just putting some crevices in the rock. And that's got a couple of gullies going directly down, and that puts the emphasis on the sun on that one. And I've got some people coming forward, so while I'm in that area I might as well put the people in. They've got jackets on, so it's given a suggestion. And then so put in the middle, and then the shoulders, stopping at the waist, going down to the shorts he's wearing over a wetsuit, I think, and then putting in the arms. And the head, I'll go back to the Naples yellow and crimson mix, and the same over here. And for the hair, I'm just going to mix a dark brown because I've got lots of dark other colours. It's hardly going to show at all, and I don't need to show it on the others because they're too far away. But what I do need to do is to put in something behind them, so I'm going to put in some more shadows. Just cover the white paper, clean the brush off and dry it, and then just move it a little, Now we return to the shadows and reflections. So I need a nice warm brown, mix with indigo and do the reflection of the rock, which comes to the man's waist. Always find something to map it off against, and that goes all the way out past the other rocks. Not quite straight, it's got a few undulations, and here it just sort of finishes in a wavy edge, so I'll put a wavy edge in and a few extra long lines of stray reflections. And then I've got more sand in the water here. There's a channel, so just taking some Naples yellow and yellow ochre and putting it in from the reflection to the edge of the page. Just breaks up the water. Now coming forward, I've got lots more green and rocks, so not all the water is blue, some of it is quite grey, so I'm going to use a homemade grey and go over some of the area here, put it in and add a little bit of purple. So I'm going to add cobalt violet to it just to give a little bit of a change, and the brown reflection actually comes forward and is yellow on one side from the sunny rock. So now I need some blue on the beach, so I'm going to use Cerulean blue, and there's some coming through the arch, just making it a bit bolder, a little bit further on the other side, and then in the middle just a tiny bit more. Now I've got some reflections of the people here, I can put those in, but I don't want to smudge anything that's wet. And then coming through from the sky, it's very, very pale, so I'm just going to use almost just a dirty brush to put a line in and just drop a little bit of blue into it. So coming up to the arch and the hole in it, which I love, there's more sand, so I'm using yellow ochre because it's in the shade. I'm just putting where there isn't seaweed, I'm putting sand, cleaning the brush off and just feathering it out a little bit. Now in the foreground here it's quite dark where it's wetter sand, and just make a few marks. I'm going to actually change to a bigger brush, just put a few marks in just to show that it's in shade and it's slightly darker. This is a good way to clean the palette, use all the colours, and the sand licks up to the stone. There's sort of an invisible join there. I'm not sure whether it goes through the gap or not, but I can sort that out with shadows in a minute. And then there's a very dark line here where the sand's very wet, and then going back to lighter sand. I'm just going to get some indigo and just mix it in, drop some darker areas in. Just to give a little bit of variety. So now returning to the rocks, which have got different facets. So I'm going to start with something that's quite obvious. There's a lighter triangle on my reference, so I'm going to put that in first, and then to show that it's really light I'm going to put some dark around it. So I'm mixing burnt umber and indigo, a really dark brown, it looks like wet rock, hasn't dried out at all, going down to the waterline and into the arch itself, and letting the brush skip over the tooth of the paper, reloading the brush, going from the other direction, putting in a few bigger blobs, then not quite so dark on top of the grey wedge, and more cracks seem to be appearing. So I'll go up a little bit, add water so that it's not so dark, dry the brush off and return with homemade grey from the other direction, which I can now add to the bit that's going into the arch. It's sort of quite circular at that point. Mixing all my colours together, just putting them on, and then when it's dry I can add some hairline cracks. But I need a base coat first. Some areas are much darker than others. Going in on top with very weak yellow ochre to show that it is much lighter. And perhaps it's catching the same sun that rock is. It might be just the way the light's coming through. Put a few dark areas in so show that it is an uneven surface. And then go back to a really dark mix for the top corner here. It's very dark. I'm just feathering it out again so that it's not solid. Make it a little bit darker still, going in round the other side of the aperture here. It's very much in shadow. And then the top area, not quite so much, so I'm going to add blue to the mix. Do sideways strokes because that seems to be the way that the rock has eroded here. And it's going round in a curve, so it's lighter towards the front, which brings out the fact that the middle's nearer. Adding some Naples yellow just to bring out the highlights a little bit more. Lots of water. And then down to more grey at the bottom. It's quite dark at the bottom, but I need to do it in stages. Lots of different short marks because it is an eroded rock face, so it's not flat or even. And then darker as it gets up against the sky. So I now go back with the same colours to the little triangle that I left. Very weak. Clean the brush off. Just use the water and merge it in. Now that's got to dry till I can do a little bit more, but I can go in with the bottom here, which seems to be random rocks that are just on the floor on the beach, and just put some of those in as a darker colour. So more indigo and burnt umber, a little bit of blue just to tone it down a little bit, and they go up from the bottom where the rocks are on the beach. Feather them out and do sort of round shapes, and then change to water because it then gets to the stage that they are a bit drier. And I can put some of this dark colour over here where I've got paper showing through, which will give another lot of surface indications. You can see that it is nice rock. If you build it up in layers, you get more realistic effect. Going back to water, just taking it up to the top. See, the sea's looking much brighter through there. And I can put the reflections in of the people now it's a bit drier. So I'll start with their legs and then add a bit of wetsuit. It's just giving an indication. This man here's got more of a shadow than a reflection. And then there's more green, so I'm going to use the same green I had earlier with a little bit more chrome yellow in it, as it's on the sunny side. Just use a small brush, just put some seaweed licking in against everything, and that will help the man stand forward as well. And then a few more wiggly lines on the paint I did earlier, just to make it look more like seaweed. And it gets more rocky and darker to this corner, so slightly more paint and at a different angle. Having let some of the rocks dry, I've just warmed up the top of this one with a little bit of cadmium orange just to catch the sun, and put a few more dark rocks in this area where a stream's running through. And I've now got a rigger which has got much longer hairs and some homemade grey, and I'm going to try and put some texture on the arch. The rock here has eroded sort of cross formations, so I don't want to put everyone in, but I need to suggest it. And also, as this is protected, it's not facing as a sea, there's some sort of growth that's doing its level best to stay on there. So I'm just making odd marks, and this side has had a harder life, so it's just more random cracks. Just put in the different surfaces. I'm going to go back with yellow ochre and do the same thing, just make some little highlights just where the brush catches on the paper, and go back to a different colour, which is the dark brown I made earlier, and from a different direction just put a few more marks in. And I've got a very light area here that needs a little bit more careful handling, and the weathering of it, it seems to have chipped off, that the marks are going up and down. So what I'll do is put them in and then go over it with a clean brush and just soften them. I've got quite a few more to do down here. I don't want this to look completely dark as though it's sort of been observed at night, but it needs to be quite dark. So now I'll get a number 8 brush, or the biggest brush you've got. Don't make it too wet, and then just gently soften some of the paint marks that you've put down. Not necessarily all of them, but some of them, and let the water do the work. Now while it's still very wet, I'm going to get the bigger brush and take some of the marks further up. So I'm going to use the homemade grey and just put in some slightly darker marks on the wet paper, and they find their own route. And then I've got to deal with this area that's very prominent. I just want to soften it a little bit. So I'm going to take some of the indigo that was left and just drop that in at the bottom. And then coming round up here, it's very dark where it's in shadow. And by putting the dark on, it makes the hole in the middle look as though it's more recessed. I've just mixed up some more darks. And going back to a small brush, I've got strong homemade grey and weaker homemade grey that I've watered down. And I've got burnt umber and indigo. So what I'm going to do is, without making it look a nighttime picture, is just add some dark at the bottom. So I'll just stir those two together. Put the dark in at the very bottom, where it's probably a lot more in shade and doesn't dry out so often. And there's some growth coming across, which I can put in green. Just breaks it up nicely. And then going up the top with the weaker homemade grey, because it's in a different position, changing to a bigger brush just to make it bounce a bit more over the tooth of the paper. So I'm just being quite random. I'll just take it across, and then I need to show the difference between these areas, so I need a different colour really. So I'm going to try a little bit of Venetian or Indian red, whichever one you've got, and just show the difference between the rocks with a different colour. Now I want to send that back a little bit, so I'm going to use yellow ochre and just drop it in as I did earlier, just randomly to show the cavities in the rock, and it will send the pigments back and make it look more of an uneven surface. Just an ordinary flat brush. Just take it back, just gently loosen the paint, and I'll just loosen the paint a little bit here to make a more uneven edge. When you're painting, sometimes things can suddenly stand out afterwards and it wasn't necessarily what you had in mind. And I'll do the same at the top. Just take the paint back a little bit, and then when I've got it on the brush, move it down to the lighter area. I will put some more green in here for the foliage, just a little bit. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you'll go and find a Cornish beach to paint yourselves quite soon. Thank you very much for watching.